Some people become famous. Michael Jackson became mythology. He sold over 750 million records. He redefined what a human body could do on a stage. Governments knew his name. Children who had never heard English knew every word of his songs. And on the morning of June 25th, 2009, the most recognized human being on the planet died alone in a bedroom, terrified, desperate, and unable to sleep, while the people paid to protect him watched it happen. This is the story of how the most powerful entertainer who ever lived became completely powerless, and how nobody stopped it. Quick pause, and I mean it, just one moment. Documentaries like this one take weeks of research to build. No studio, no network, just obsessive dedication to telling stories that actually deserve to be told. We are pushing hard for 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. Right now, we are close, but not there yet. If this story already has your attention, hit subscribe. Be one of the originals, the ones who found this channel before everyone else did. One click. That's all it takes to make sure you never miss what comes next. And drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. We're almost there. Let's finish this together. Now back to Michael. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Never Got to Be One. Gary, Indiana, in the 1960s was not a place that produced legends. It was a place that produced workers, men who clocked into the steel mills before dawn and came home with hands that told the story of every hour they had traded away. It was into this world that Michael Joseph Jackson was born on August 29, 1958. The seventh of 9 children in a house with a single bathroom and a father who had decided, with absolute certainty, that his children were going to be more than Gary could offer. Joseph Jackson was not a cruel man in the way that history sometimes simplifies. He was a man who understood, with the clarity that poverty provides, that talent without discipline is just noise. And so he drilled his children, Michael most relentlessly of all, with a ferocity that left no room for childhood. Rehearsals ran for hours. Mistakes were not tolerated. The stage was the only space in the household where excellence was rewarded, and Michael, who had an instinct for performance that bordered on supernatural, chased that reward with everything he had. By the age of 5, Michael was the lead vocalist of the Jackson 5. By 8, he was recording professionally. By 10, he had performed on stages that grown men spent entire careers trying to reach. The world looked at the Jackson 5 and saw a phenomenon. Michael, from the inside, was learning something that would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. He learned that love was conditional. That approval had to be earned through performance. That the moment you stopped delivering, the warmth disappeared. His father's method, however effective commercially, had planted a belief deep in Michael's psychology that would never fully uproot. That he was only as valuable as his last performance. That rest was a risk. That ordinariness was abandonment. The boy who made the world stop and watch never learned how to simply exist without an audience. And the tragedy of Michael Jackson does not begin on June 25, 2009. It begins in a rehearsal room in Gary, Indiana, where a 5-year-old discovered that performing was the only time anyone treated him like he mattered. The stage gave him everything. It also took everything. He just didn't know that yet. He had learned the lesson young: perform or disappear. And for the next 4 decades, Michael Jackson performed at a level no human being had ever sustained. But all that brilliance, all that discipline, all that breathtaking talent could not protect him from what was quietly building in the background. Chapter 2. The Genius Hiding in Plain Sight. When Michael Jackson parted ways with Motown in 1975 and the Jackson 5 signed with Epic Records, the music industry was not particularly worried. Child acts aged out. Their audiences grew up and moved on. The conventional wisdom was clear. The boy who had charmed the 1970s would not survive the 1980s. Conventional wisdom had not met Michael Jackson as an adult. What the industry failed to understand was that Michael had spent his entire adolescence not merely performing but studying, obsessively, encyclopedically, every performer who had ever commanded a stage. He had absorbed Fred Astaire's precision. He had decoded James Brown's physicality. He had studied mime, martial arts, and the way that camera lenses flatten movement, then engineered his choreography to explode through that flatness in ways that had never been attempted. He was not just talented. He was a strategist who had disguised his strategy as magic. In 1979, Off the Wall became the first solo album in history by a black artist to produce 4 top 10 singles. The industry noticed, but they had not seen anything yet. In 1982, Michael Jackson released Thriller. What followed was not simply a commercial success, it was a category redefinition. Thriller spent 37 weeks at #1 on the Billboard 200. It has sold an estimated 70 million copies globally, making it the best-selling album in recorded history. But the number that changed everything was not the sales figure. It was 14 minutes. The Thriller music video, 14 minutes long, directed with cinematic ambition, featuring a full horror narrative and choreography that required weeks of rehearsal, was not a promotional tool. It was a product. Michael Jackson understood, before the industry had any framework for this understanding, that the visual component of music was not supplementary. It was the primary event. He did not make videos to promote albums. He made films that happened to include songs. He then did something that the business side of the industry studied for decades afterward. He purchased the Beatles' publishing catalog in 1985 for $47.5 million, outbidding his own friend Paul McCartney in the process. Critics called it a betrayal. Michael called it business. He had recognized that owning the underlying intellectual property of music was more valuable than any royalty agreement, and he acted on that recognition while everyone else was still debating whether it was appropriate. This was the asymmetric advantage that defined Michael Jackson's rise. While other artists competed on the same playing field, better songs, bigger tours, more publicity, Michael kept redefining what the playing field was. He did not try to win the existing game. He invented new ones, faster than anyone could respond. By the late 1980s, he was not simply the most famous entertainer in the world. He was a self-contained industry, a brand, a corporation, a mythology, operating at a scale that had no precedent and no blueprint. He was, by every external measure, untouchable. Untouchable. That word matters, because the people who believe themselves untouchable are exactly the ones who stop watching the ground beneath their feet. And by the time the 1990s arrived, the ground under Michael Jackson was beginning to shift in ways that no amount of genius could reverse. Chapter 3: Neverland and the Architecture of Escape. In 1988, Michael Jackson purchased a 2,700-acre property in the Santa Ynez Valley of California for $19.5 million and renamed it Neverland Ranch. He then spent the next decade transforming it into something that had no real category: part private zoo, part amusement park, part film studio, part fortress. It had a Ferris wheel, a roller coaster, a movie theater, a train station, a full petting zoo with giraffes and elephants, and a security perimeter that kept the outside world at a carefully managed distance. He named it after the island in Peter Pan where children never grow old. The symbolism was not subtle. Michael Jackson had spent his childhood performing for adults, and his adolescence becoming one of the most scrutinized human beings on Earth. What Neverland represented was the childhood he had been denied, a space engineered to be the opposite of Gary, Indiana, the opposite of relentless rehearsal, the opposite of everything conditional and punishing. He was not building a home. He was building a monument to everything that had been taken from him before he was old enough to understand what he was losing. The annual cost of maintaining Neverland at its peak ran to approximately $5 million. Staff numbered in the dozens. The property became a traveling destination for children's charities, a site of constant activity and engineered joy. Michael Jackson was, by multiple accounts of those who knew him, genuinely at his most relaxed within its gates, freed for brief windows from the performance that the outside world demanded of him every waking moment. But Neverland was also the architecture of a deeper problem. The more elaborate the escape, the more acute the reality it was escaping from. Michael had built an empire so vast and so expensive that it required constant revenue to sustain itself. The Bad World Tour, the Dangerous World Tour, the History Tour, each one a commercial necessity disguised as artistic expression. He was not touring because he wanted to. He was touring because Neverland, the staff, the zoo, the entourage, and the legal fees of a life lived under permanent public scrutiny required it. And then came 1993. The allegations that emerged that year, a lawsuit filed by the family of a 13-year-old boy who had been a frequent guest at Neverland, detonated inside Michael Jackson's life with the force of something that no publicity team, no legal strategy, and no amount of money could fully contain. The civil case was settled out of court for a reported $23 million. No criminal charges were filed. But the settlement, made without admission of wrongdoing, created a narrative that would follow Michael Jackson for the rest of his life. A shadow that darkened every headline, every performance, every business dealing that came after. His record sales fell. His sponsors quietly withdrew. The mythology that had taken 30 years to construct began to develop fractures that even the most loyal audience could see. And Michael responded the way he had always responded to pain. He disappeared deeper into the empire, raised the walls of Neverland higher, and kept performing. The empire was still standing, but the man inside it was beginning to crack in ways that the cameras were not allowed to capture. Because the real story of Michael Jackson's fall is not about allegations or lawsuits or tabloids. It is about a man who had never learned how to ask for help. And what happens when that person runs out of options? Chapter 4. The Cost of Living as a Symbol. Michael Jackson gave 2 marriages to the public and neither of them to himself. His 1994 marriage to Lisa Marie Presley, daughter of Elvis, heir to one of music's great dynasties, was viewed by the outside world as either a publicity maneuver or a genuine romantic connection, depending on who was narrating. What is less disputed is that both parties were, in different ways, people who had been raised by extraordinary fame into extraordinary isolation. They had the specific loneliness of those who are recognized everywhere and known nowhere. The marriage lasted 20 months. His subsequent marriage to Debbie Rowe, with whom he had 2 children, Michael Jr. and Paris, lasted 3 years before dissolving. A third child, Prince Michael II, was born via surrogate in 2002. Michael's relationship with his children was, by most accounts, the most genuinely unguarded part of his adult life. He was fiercely protective of them. Famously so, to the point where the image of an infant held briefly over a hotel balcony in Berlin became one of the most scrutinized moments of his later career. That incident, jarring as it appeared, was itself a window into something important. Michael Jackson's judgment, under the pressure of decades of relentless public life, had become unreliable in ways that even he could not fully perceive. The people around him had sorted themselves, over time, into 2 categories. There were those who were genuinely devoted to his well-being, a small and frequently marginalized group. And there were those for whom Michael Jackson was an economic ecosystem, a source of income, influence, and proximity to power that required his continued function, but not necessarily his happiness. The difference between the 2 groups was not always visible from the inside. By the mid-2000s, following a second and deeply damaging criminal trial in 2005, in which Michael was acquitted on all counts but emerged visibly diminished, he had retreated from public life almost entirely, living abroad in Bahrain, then Ireland, then Las Vegas, surrounded by a rotating cast of advisors, security personnel, and medical staff whose collective judgment he had come to depend on in place of his own. He had always needed an audience to feel real. Now, with the global audience uncertain and the intimate circle compromised, Michael Jackson existed in a state of profound disconnection from anything that could be called a stable life. He was 50 years old. He had not performed a major concert in over a decade. And someone had just offered him the largest comeback deal in entertainment history. 50 shows at the O2 Arena in London. This is it, they called it. The announcement sold out in hours. The world wanted Michael Jackson back. The question nobody in his inner circle asked loudly enough was whether Michael Jackson was in any condition to come back. Chapter 5. The Last Night on Carolwood Drive. In the months leading up to the This Is It residency, people who worked closely with Michael Jackson began logging concerns that, taken individually, could be explained away. Taken together, they formed a picture that should have stopped everything. He was losing weight at a rate that alarmed the production team. Rehearsal footage, later released publicly, showed moments of brilliance interrupted by stretches where he appeared disoriented, diminished, moving through the choreography at reduced capacity. Colleagues described him as frightened. Not of the performance. Michael Jackson never feared a stage. He was frightened of sleeping. Or more precisely, of what happened when he couldn't. Michael Jackson had struggled with insomnia for years, a condition rooted in anxiety, chronic pain from old injuries, and the particular psychological torment of a mind that could not quiet itself. He had found, over time, that conventional sleep aids did nothing for him. And he had found someone who told him he had a solution. Dr. Conrad Murray, his personal physician, had been administering propofol, a powerful surgical anesthetic, to help Michael sleep. Not in a clinical setting. Not with monitoring equipment. In his bedroom, at his rented mansion on Carolwood Drive in Los Angeles, while the rest of the household staff went about their routines outside the door. On the night of June 24, 2009, Michael Jackson could not sleep. Murray administered propofol. At some point in the early hours of June 25th, Michael's breathing stopped. Murray's response, the timeline reconstructed from phone records and subsequent testimony, was delayed and disorganized in ways that the prosecution would later argue were criminally negligent. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. Michael Jackson was pronounced dead at 2:26 p.m. on June 25, 2009. He was 50 years old. The man who had sold 750 million records, who had danced in ways that made physicists curious about the human body, who had shaken hands with presidents and been mobbed in countries whose languages he did not speak. In the end, he could not cross the most ordinary threshold in human existence. He could not fall asleep safely in his own bed. His wealth had built walls around him so high that no one with the authority to intervene could reach him. And the one person inside those walls with both the access and the medical knowledge to protect him had failed him completely. He had conquered every stage on Earth. And he died in a bedroom, alone, because he could not sleep. The most powerful entertainer in history could not buy himself one quiet night. That is not irony. That is the full and devastating weight of what unchecked isolation does to a human being, no matter how much they are worth. Chapter 6. What remains when the music stops? Conrad Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in 2011 and served 2 years in prison. Neverland was eventually sold. The animals were relocated. The rides went silent. The estate that had taken decades and hundreds of millions of dollars to construct was listed, reduced in price repeatedly, and ultimately changed hands. Michael Jackson's children grew up. His music continued to sell, posthumous releases, catalog streams, tribute concerts. The estate generated over $1 billion in revenue in the years following his death. The irony is total. Michael Jackson, in death, became more commercially productive than he had been in the final years of his life. But no revenue figure accounts for what was lost on Carolwood Drive. The 50 shows never happened. The comeback never came. The man who had given the world more than it had any right to expect died asking for something as simple as sleep. He had conquered everything. And in the end, it conquered him. That is the loneliest fall of all. Michael Jackson had everything the world told him should make him happy. And he died unable to get through a single night without medical intervention. If this documentary made you feel something, subscribe. We are this close to 1,000 subscribers this month. Don't be the person who watched the whole thing, felt it, and kept scrolling. One click. That's all. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me which part of his story hit you hardest. I read every single one. More stories like this are coming. Stories about power, about loss, about the gap between what we chase and what we actually need. Be here for them. Subscribe. Comment. And I'll see you on the next one.